This week, summer reading, and what better way to kick it off than with David Sedaris, who needs zero introduction. He'll be here to talk about his brand new book, Theft by Finding.
When I started keeping a diary, I looked back and I thought, this is awful. And it's going to be awful for a long time.
What can a new history tell us about the Old West? Christopher Knowlton will join us to talk about Cattle Kingdom, the hidden history of the Cowboy West.
The cattle industry was really the precursor of the great industrial enterprises that emerged in the late 19th century and into the 20th century.
Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. David Sedaris joins us now. His new book is called Theft by Finding, Diaries 1977 to 2002. David, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So this diary starts in 1977. Is that when you actually began writing the diary, or did you sort of arbitrarily pick a date?
No, I believe my first diary entry is in there. I just started one day. I was hitchhiking around the country with my friend, Ronnie, and I was writing letters to my friends and people in my family, but I didn't have an address where they could write me back. So I just started writing to myself.
Did you write every day?
Every single day.
So you obviously have edited this down somewhat.
Oh, I mean, I have 64 volumes of my diary, and each one is thicker than this book. And a lot of it is crazy person, tiny letters, front and back page. So this is just a tiny fraction of my diary.
So how did you go about editing it for this book? I mean, did that take forever?
It took forever, and I tried to detach myself and think, would this be of interest to anyone? I mean, a lot of it wasn't even interesting to me. Or it was just interesting for, nostalgic reasons. So I was just looking for things that might possibly interest someone who I don't know.
I'm wondering if you'll get reaction from some of the panhandlers with whom you've interacted over the years, because that seemed to be one of the running themes throughout the book. Unless you edit it out, but everyone is constantly asking you for money or food.
We know the reason. I'm small. I'm 5'5". And when you're a small man,
They come after you.
They come after you. You get asked for money and for things all the time. And Hugh, I'll be with my boyfriend Hugh. No one asks him for anything. They're right to me. And I think it has to do with my size. And plus, I don't look intimidating. I mean, I've got a big pansy pinned to my jacket.
Yes. It's
inviting. It says, ask me for spare change. That's basically what it says.
But what's interesting, too, is that, the other evolution that you see over time here is sort of going from your meth-taking impoverished days to a more successful and sober era. But no matter what, that's a constant. Like in 1977, when you had no money, they were still asking you for money. And it runs up through 2002. Oh,
and it's a constant today. People go to the airport to ask for money. You're standing outside the airport. Oh, our flight was delayed, and we're looking for some money. We just want to buy lunch. And it's like, nobody travels without their wallet. What's so interesting to me is that they think that might work. I mean, because they don't know the world of the airport. Or, oh, our car is parked here. I came to pick my daughter up. We need $6 for the parking. People who go to the airport have $6 for parking. I mean, but they don't know how unconvincing they are. That's fascinating to me.
In addition to the panhandling, it's amazing to me how many times you witness just these arbitrary acts of violence and outbursts of anger. And I wonder if you just chose to write about them or if you edited around that. But, people are always having incredible tantrums around you, not necessarily related to you.
I lived in a neighborhood in Chicago called Uptown when I went to Chicago to go to school. And it was an incredibly violent neighborhood. And you would see men hitting women. You would see children being severely beaten, animals being beaten. And it really, I have to say, it really affected my outlook on the world. And I lived there for maybe just in that particular location for 3 years. And when I moved out of the neighborhood, my outlook so brightened. But it was striking reading over the diary how if you live in a neighborhood like that, just what it does to your worldview. And you're left thinking that people are basically cruel and cornered and not terribly bright. And just how it changes your attitude to like live in a pretty neighborhood. When you live in a pretty neighborhood, what happens is there comes a day and you think, I deserve to live in a pretty neighborhood. And then the changes really come.
But you make the outbursts of anger sound incredibly sober, and yet they provide some of the funniest passages in the book, just like the incredible heights of anger and foul language that people will be sort of moved toward at the smallest provocation.
Well, that's always interested me, always. I mean, whenever there's a couple fighting or somebody who's just got a quick temper, if I've got hours to kill at the airport, I go to the desk where people have problems and I just sit
lurk
there and I listen. And it's because if you're going to curse to someone at the airport, the thing is you can't look them in the eye. You can say your curse word looking down, but you can't say it looking at them. And so a lot of people don't understand that rule. So I just like to see like who's not in the know today.
There are a couple of moments in here of anger. There's one here from 1991, where you were actually the perpetrator of the violence.
November 1st, 1991, New York. Amy and I met Jeff and Tina for a drink last night at El Teddy's, the fancy Mexican place in Tribeca that sometimes feels exciting and sometimes feels awful. Last night it was the latter. I was standing in front of a woman who was seated at the bar, waiting on friends, and said to her, "Excuse me," as I reached over and dunked a tortilla chip in salsa. I then put it in my mouth and was chewing away when she said, "Hey, you got tomato stains on my pants." I looked down and watched as she stabbed at the red spots with her napkin. She was super angry, like this was the last straw. Her friends weren't showing up, the place was too crowded, and now some idiot had spilled salsa on her new tan-colored slacks. "Oh, gosh," I said, "I'm terribly sorry about your pants." With the letter P, a shard of tortilla chip flew from my mouth right into the corner of her eye. I couldn't believe it. "Jesus Christ," she said. She wanted me dead, and it only got worse when her friends showed up, and I caught her pointing at me, the creep who ruined her outfit and then spit on her.
I love and admire the way in which you and your siblings go at each other, and Paul in particular, your brother Paul. There's this one part where I guess Amy has a pet peeve about loose change. And so in order to exact revenge, what did he do exactly?
He changed $20 into quarters, nickels, dimes, and pennies and scattered it through her apartment. And then he coated her doorknobs with, I don't know if it was Crisco or butter. He'll do that to anybody. I mean, you can't turn your back on that guy. As a child, he was the prankster, and now he's almost 50. Nothing's changed.
But you've left out the pièce de résistance, his last move in that particular act of, I don't know what it was.
He peed a little on her bed.
Yes, the fact that it specified a little. I read that part aloud to my children who are often violent towards one another as it could be a lot worse. Like, at least you're not in this sort of situation.
I feel almost like peeing a little on someone's bed is okay.
Really?
Like just a little, just a few drops is acceptable, especially if that person has pets, because the pets have been doing it.
The other thing that runs throughout the book is, and I don't know if you have a penchant for this kind of thing or if it's accidental, but you go to a lot of bad movies that they don't seem like deliberately bad movie choices, and they're not meant to be good movies, but they're kind of in that middle zone. And there was one section where you talk about going to see Hollow Man.
Good morning, sir. Good morning, Ed. Your team's in early today. Something special going on? Sorry, Ed. You know the rules.
September 21st, 2000, Paris. Hugh and I went to see Hollow Man, the worst movie I've seen in a long time. It opened with Kevin Bacon dicking around on his computer, which is always a sure sign of trouble. He played a brilliant scientist, as did Elizabeth Shue and Josh Brolin. The team had discovered how to make gorillas invisible, and now it was time to move on to humans. I'd always thought that if I were invisible, I'd spend all my time at free movies, but now I'm not so sure. Hollow Man was just as stupid as it could be, and the audience howled all the way through it. I can usually shake off a bad movie, but not Hugh. He railed all the way home, stopping to point out piles of dog crap. "That's your movie right there," he'd say. Whenever it's bad, it's automatically my movie. I wrote it, cast it, and directed it with the sole purpose of ruining his evening. I haven't heard him mention it this morning, but the day is young.
You think you're alone.
Why did you have to go out in public?
In Paris, I had a pass, so I could go to as many movies as I wanted, and it was $17 a month. So I'd see anything that moves. There was a theater called the UGC Orient Express, and every movie that played there was bad.
Is that in Leal?
Yeah, that didn't keep me from going there. I mean, the fact that a movie was playing there meant it was bad.
That's the one that's like 4 levels down,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
And you need to leave a trail of crumbs to find your way back out of the basement.
Yeah, I love the way that the French are so encouraging of movies too, that like if you're unemployed, the movies are less expensive for you.
Isn't that a nice touch? In Paris, I find that people are generally very respectful during a movie. They don't text, they don't talk. Japan is like that too, a lovely place to go to the movies.
How did you choose the 25 years? Was it just a nice, neat cutoff?
Yeah, I guess it couldn't have been any longer, or the proportions would have been off. It's like the dictionary, it's just, who wants to touch it? It's just too big. My boyfriend Hugh calls the book David Copperfield Sedaris. I mean, there's a pretty profound change in the first part. Not in me. I don't feel like I've changed. Although, of course you do. Of course, when you have opportunities, you change. Your outlook changes. I went from basically having no opportunities to, having a great many opportunities.
Well, you also see your progression as a writer in the book. And when you start off in the early parts, you're working as a visual artist, and then you move on to playwriting and then to writing. When you went back to work on this, were you able to see the change in the quality of your writing and the purpose, it seemed to me, of your writing?
I could. I mean, I can go back through my early diaries and I can say, oh, look who discovered Joan Didion. Because she's such a strong stylist, so I'd be writing like her. Or Joy Williams, also a very strong stylist. And to this day, I can go through my diary like from 6 months ago and often tell who it was that I was reading or listening to. When you talk about the writing in the book, you can't write without reading. Mm-hmm. You can't do it. And it's normal to start off and imitate other people, and it's normal to be pretentious, and it's normal to write 100.
Which you did.
Yeah, and think that you're so brilliant because you did it. There were a lot of pages like that, and I thought, okay, I can't get away with more than one of those in the book. But yeah, I do see that on the page. I do see finding my voice, I guess you would call it.
Were these diaries that you would go back periodically and look at, or had you sort of, once you finished a diary, you would set it aside and never return to it, and this was the first time that you revisited all of it?
When I started keeping a diary, I looked back and I thought, this is awful. And it's going to be awful for a long time because, why would I start playing piano and not expect to be awful in 2 weeks? So I really put it away for a long time before I turned back to it. And then I think I've read through all of my diaries like twice because I have a guide on my computer. A lot of what's in there is not of interest to anybody, but if something is of interest, then I'll put it down on my guide. And that helps me if I'm working on a story or an essay. I can go back through it. Like if I were to write an essay about all the haircuts I've ever had, then I could just type haircut in there and it would be, because I write about every haircut I've ever had. Because my hair's not special in any way. All that's special is that encounter. That's going to come in handy someday.
So you turn back to these diaries as sort of primary material when you were doing your essay writing?
Yeah. I mean, I'm closing a story right now with the New Yorker. And so part of the story took place in Hawaii in February. So it was great. I just was there for 8 days. And so I reread my entire 8-day diary from when I was there. We stayed in this condominium that we found online somewhere. So I had in there, that there was a 10-inch tall crucifix on the kitchen wall. I had written a description of the photo collages, the color of the paneling on the inside of the house, Sometimes you write all that down and you don't ever need it for anything, but sometimes it comes in handy. Then when you're writing the story, you're like, why didn't I write down like every word of that conversation that Hugh and I had? But you have to live your life at the same time.
You have sections of this book where you're depicting painful periods in your life. And I mean, the one that stands out is early on where you have this moment and you're saying, well, I'm either going to become a total meth addict or I'm going to stop right now. And then like 2 entries later, you're doing meth again. Did you sort of feel compelled to portray yourself as you were and sort of warts and all during these periods? Why include that?
When I was looking for things to cut out, I was more inclined to keep something that made me look bad than to get rid of it. Something that would make somebody else look bad, that's kind of a different story. But because usually when you're admitting the bad things, that's how people relate to you.
Right.
Because they think, oh, I did that too.
I too looked in the mirror one day
But to be truly addicted to a drug it's a dark, horrible feeling. And it just overtakes your life. And it's like a train and you have to get off of it. And you know what will happen if you don't get off of it, but the opportunity presents itself, and I don't know why some people are more susceptible to that than others. I mean, I had a neighbor at the time who would do meth, but she could have it in her freezer and do it like once a month, where I had to get up first thing in the morning and I had to do it all day, and I would go days and days without sleeping, and just always thinking of when you can get more. And I was so fortunate to be addicted to meth when it wasn't popular. I mean, my dealer moved out of town and that was it. But
There's
today,
no more available.
Right, today it'd be the easiest thing in the world. And I don't know that I could have quit if she hadn't moved away. And she moved back to town. And then she said, okay, I'm open for business again. And I was able to say, no, I remember what that was like, getting off of it, and I don't ever want to go through that again. And I love drugs, but I never took meth again after that.
Why did you decide to publish these diaries now?
Whenever I do a stage show, I always end by reading things from my diary. Whenever something would work and get a nice reaction, I would put it into a file I have on my computer called Diary That Works.
As opposed to the diaries that don't work?
Yeah. And so I thought I would publish that file. It was my editor who said, why don't you go back to the very beginning and why don't you find things that aren't necessarily funny and see what those look like? Mm-hmm. So it didn't turn out to be the book that I imagined it to be. I thought it was just going to be that book of gut busters. But that wouldn't have really told a story. Well, the story that would have told was, look how clever I am. And I think people already know how clever I am. So
They do. It's not a look how clever I am book, but it definitely shows that you are clever. And you're doing another one.
Well, the idea is to do a second part, but I'll just have to look at it, what I've got there, because there's not an arc to it that I can see. Perhaps I peaked a number of years ago, and
So
then
it'll be a downward arc.
it'll be a downward spiral. Could be
With a tragic ending. I'm sure it'll have a happy ending. David, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Pamela, for having me.
David Sedaris is the author of many books, the latest of which is Theft by Finding, Diaries 1977 to 2002, and I can assure you it is very funny and very clever. Christopher Nolton joins us now. His new book is called Cattle Kingdom, The Hidden History of the Cowboy West. Christopher, thank you for being here.
Hello, Pamela. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you worked in finance, and then you were a financial journalist in London for Fortune magazine. How did you get from that to cowboys?
Well, I had retired early from a job in the investment business and moved out to Jackson, Wyoming, and I was literally prospecting for a book idea when I stumbled on the story of the Johnson County War. I wasn't really terribly familiar with the period, but it caught my attention, and I ended up backing into the story of the cattle boom that took place from the end of the Civil War to about 1892, and discovered that it really was, among other things, a business story. A kind of reminded me of the sort of long-form financial journalist story that Fortune did in its heyday in over 40 years. This book is telling two stories really almost simultaneously, and that's the story of the cattle industry as well as the story of the cowboy and what life was really like in the 1880s on the open range, what it was like to trail cattle, what it was like to arrive at a cattle town in Kansas, and what sort of hijinks went on, and basically to tell that story, which is really a kind of archetypical one in American history.
What is the time period that we're talking about? When does this cowboy era begin, and what marks the end?
Well, so it began right after the Civil War. There was a good reason for that. The Confederacy had collapsed. The currency was worthless. The poor ranchers down in Texas had no money whatsoever. The basic infrastructure of society was gone. The one thing they had in abundance were these longhorn cattle that had been procreating while they were off fighting for the Confederacy. Meanwhile, in the North, the appetite for beef had grown, and people were getting interested in eating steaks in addition to pork. And the Texans realized if they could just get their cattle up to the north, there was a real business opportunity for them. So they began to drive the cattle north, and that kicked off the boom, which lasted for about 25 years. And it became a absolute investment frenzy. I mean, it attracted all kinds of wealthy investors from all around the world. It wasn't just a phenomenon of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. It led to overexpansion, and the period really ends with the range wars of 1892, in particular this Johnson County War, which historians really feel brought the curtain down on the era. And after that, the approaches to ranching changed quite dramatically.
When people think about cowboys in sort of popular culture as an American icon, it is odd that they seem to leave out, this one important element, which is the cows. And it sounds like part of what you're doing in this book is to really focus on the cattle as a market, as an animal population.
That's right, Pamela. I realized that it was also true that the cattle industry was really the precursor of the great industrial enterprises that emerged in the late 19th century and into the 20th century, and that the industrialization of agriculture, that is to say, the mechanization of the slaughtering of the cattle, was enormously important for what came later. Really, the whole American century was based on business precepts that the slaughterhouse owners and operators developed to run these enormous plants. They were, in fact, the largest industrial enterprises of their day, and the largest until the automobile industry replaced it early in the 20th century.
What was the actual sort of workday of a cowboy like?
Well, one of the things that I try to talk about in the book is how much both more rugged and difficult and arduous the work was than it's depicted in the movies, but also in a lot of ways that it was safer at least from the sense that the violence wasn't much of a problem. There were few gunfights, but vice, of course, was a real consideration. And the kind of challenges that these guys face as they try to bring these cattle north through drought conditions, crossing deserts as well as tumultuous rivers, and the strategies for keeping the cattle from milling and stampeding in thunderstorms, and it's really kind of extraordinary. And it was a tremendous accomplishment, and they were not terribly richly rewarded for their efforts, I hasten to add. It was a tough line of work. I'm not debunking the myth. I'm just trying to get to the actual facts of what life was really like. It's hard work.
I want to go back to the subtitle of your book, because you call this the hidden history of the Cowboy West. Why hidden?
I know that when I was researching it, I kept finding things that surprised me that I hadn't known, and I think the reader will find that too. There are a lot of things such as the role that the British played. Most people don't appreciate the fact that the British sort of sat astride the world in the 19th century, and they had all the capital. So, of course, they were the ones who funded the very earliest cattle companies and ended up not dominating the trade by any means, but they had some of the most visible ranches out there. And then, of course, partly because there was all this money in the business, you had things like Cheyenne, Wyoming, spring up as a rather sophisticated hub for the industry. And there's a gentleman's club there where in the middle of the 1880s, you have English lords and American aristocrats sitting around drinking Grand Crus and eating haute cuisine and smoking Cuban cigars in black tie, and it's just not quite the image that we expect of the Old West. So there are a number of things like that, and then a few revelations that I want to keep as a secret for the reader.
Well, I will leave it to readers to discover some of the colorful characters in the book and one well-known character, Teddy Roosevelt. The book, again, is called Cattle Kingdom, The Hidden History of the Cowboy West by Christopher Knowlton. Christopher, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it.
Alexandra Alter joins us now for Notes from the Publishing World. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
So this is the biggest week in the publishing industry.
Yes, everyone has gathered in one cramped building at the Javits Center for Book Expo this week. This is where publishers kind of trot out their biggest titles of the year. Librarians and booksellers and even fans come in to get their books signed by authors. And it's exciting this year. I mean, a lot of people in the industry complain about having to trek over to kind of the armpit of Manhattan to the Javits Center. But I would say the mood was upbeat this year. There's a ton of huge books coming out by kind of blockbuster authors. So I think publishers are really counting on them to sort of, generate a lot of revenue this year. There's, of course, John Grisham has 2 books coming out this year, which is a huge plus for his publisher.
That's the big new thing, to have more than one.
You have to have more than
book
one.
come
One
out
is
in a
not
given
enough.
year.
Exactly. I mean, you could credit or blame, depending on your view on it, James Patterson for sort of upping the ante.
Exactly.
So he has 2. Actually, Lee Child has 2 as well. I think he has a short story collection and a novel. But John Grisham has a non-legal thriller and then a legal thriller because he's sort of obligated to do his legal thriller. Dan Brown has another book coming out with Robert Langdon, his famous Harvard symbologist, I believe, is his job. And they're being very secretive about the plot, but I think the names Dan Brown and Robert Langdon are going to be enough to pre-sell a lot of copies. Another book I think people are very excited about is a collaboration between Stephen King and Owen King that's coming out in the fall. Mm-hmm. And they appeared at the Book Expo at the author breakfast and gave a little talk. And
the author breakfasts, I have to say, are a lot of fun.
They are fun.
Who was on the adult author breakfast this year?
So we had Stephen and Owen King were there. The actress Whitney Cummings was there. Captain Scott Kelly, who is an astronaut and is publishing a book about his year in space. The novelist Jesmyn Ward, she was there to talk about her upcoming novel, Sing, Unburied Sing. And Claire Massoud was there as well.
Wow. Who's on the kids' breakfast panel?
It's been a really exciting and interesting year in YA, I would say. And I think the kids' breakfast panel reflected that. Of course, it's not just young adult authors, but middle grade. We had this year, Jason Reynolds was on the panel, and
he is amazing.
He is amazing.
Have you ever heard him speak?
I've interviewed him, and I was just enthralled.
So charismatic.
Yes. There's always a handful of celebrities publishing their first children's books, and they're often featured at BEA, at Book Expo. And this year, the actress Isla Fisher was there to discuss the first book in her new series, Marge in Charge. We had some big names in politics at the Books Expo this year. Senator Al Franken was there to discuss his new book, WTF is Happening. And he was actually in conversation with the comedian and podcast host Mark Maron. And of course, probably the biggest political name there was Hillary Clinton. She has a memoir coming out this fall, and so she gave us a talk, and she's been very candid and talking quite a bit lately. So I think a lot of people were interested to hear that.
You know, people complain a lot about VA and about the Javits Center, but I think for the most part, a lot of publishing people secretly love it.
I sort of secretly love it. I think part of the fun
well,
of it...
I secretly love it too, so now it's not so secret, Alexandra.
No longer a secret.
What do you love?
I love kind of cruising around and just looking at the lines of people who are waiting to meet authors and get books signed. And there's librarians from all over the country. Everyone's got their literary tote bags. They're kind of stuffing them with galleys. And there's just this kind of collective sense of infectious enthusiasm about books and discovery. And sometimes there are authors that I haven't heard of, and I look at this whole line stretching around. People are waiting forever, and you know, it's a nice way to sort of figure out what people are excited about, things that might not be on my radar yet.
I signed books this year in the booth for the first time, and I have to say it is so infectious, the enthusiasm among the librarians and the bloggers and the bookstore owners. And this is why I think that the publishing people secretly love it. A lot of the publishing people stand on the line, too, to get their book signed.
They do. Yeah. And I mean, these are the people who are kind of out in the trenches hand-selling the books or recommending them and really getting the word out. And, you know, there are other fairs, of course, like Frankfurt and London, where the big deals are done, where publishers go to acquire books and sell books and make those kinds of deals. But I feel like this event is really for the people that love books the most. And
it's the People's Expo.
Exactly. And that's, I think, another thing that's been exciting the last few years since they opened it up to readers and fans, too. That's mostly over the weekend, but that's always a huge event when readers and fans can come in and meet authors.
Very exciting. All right, Alexandra, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
My colleagues Greg Coles, John Williams, and Parl Sagel join us now to talk about what we're reading. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Welcome back, Pamela.
All right, John, you have a book open in front of you.
I do have a book
You're
open in
actually
front of me.
reading instead of talking to us.
Yeah, it's a follow-up on last week's conversation, although I'll say quickly that, you know, the great Dennis Johnson died. And so I read also this week in about an hour and a half his very slender novella called Train Dreams, which I have now already misplaced, so I don't have it with me to read from. It's a tiny book, so it's easy to misplace.
Amazing.
I love it.
Really good.
It's tiny, but it just opens up the
yeah,
whole world.
and it will have to be reread because I felt like I admired it, but there's more to get from it that I didn't in an hour and a half. But I finished I Love Dick by Chris Kraus, which Parl and I discussed last week, and I discussed it in a very kind of perfunctory way because I was only about 40 pages into it, so I felt like a dilettante. But I actually, sticking with it,
I'm amazed you stuck with it because you were not a fan.
Well, you know, early on you just get to know these two characters who I think are kind of purposely not insufferable, but they're very pretentious and they're a bit irritating. But as it goes on, it opens out into more about sort of love and obsession and art and creativity and feminism. And she writes in a lot of different registers, which is interesting. She can go from really kind of writerly, with flair, to very conversational, to diaristic. And there are lots of letters in it, obviously, to address to this man that she's obsessed with. I told Parl that I also realized about halfway through that this particular copy had been annotated by an ex-girlfriend, which is, this is not the book you want to discover that in, although it could have been worse.
In the margins, just like John.
Okay, you're going to have to share with us at least one example of marginalia.
No, fortunately, thank God, it's just sort of some brackets on some things. It's more.
But there's much to read into.
There is.
I remember discovering an
passages.
ex's annotations in Anna Karenina, but I took them all personally.
Yeah.
Of course you did.
You should.
Yeah,
you should.
I'm glad you had that experience too. It was kind of, it was petrifying. Greg, what do you have? Another writer who died fairly recently.
Yeah, this is a writer who I've read a lot of, Jim Harrison, who died within the past year. I came to Jim Harrison pretty late in his career, and he was so prolific. There was always something new. And so I just picked up, from the moment that I discovered him, I picked up and kind of kept up with him. But I never went back and read the back catalog. And so I'm finally reading the book that really made him famous, Legends of the Fall. It's a collection of 3 novellas, including the last one is the title novella, which was made into a movie with Brad Pitt back in the 90s.
Babyface Brad Pitt.
Yeah, I was just thinking that Brad Pitt has like a small body of work based on novels of the West, because didn't he do A River Runs Through It as well?
He did do A River Runs Through It. In A River Runs Through It and in Legends of the Fall, there's something very kind of, not just the West, but it's a very kind of mythical West. Jim Harrison very very boisterous, kind of fun writer. Also leaned a lot on this sort of mysticism that runs through it as a vein in his work. He's a pretty aphoristic writer. He just writes with a lot of gusto. I'm not yet to Legends of the Fall in this book. I'm partway through the second novella now, but he writes with a lot of plot and just characters who are sort of outlaw characters. There's actually a lot of overlap with Dennis Johnson in terms of the kinds of characters that he writes about and the mood of the work.
And like manliness without being annoyingly macho.
Yeah, like a kind of wounded masculinity.
Yes, that's exactly
which all
right.
masculinity.
Do you have a favorite? You figured us out.
Redundancy.
Do you have a favorite book of his? Because I haven't really started, and it's hard to know.
I don't. He wrote novellas a lot. He wrote novels. He wrote short stories. He wrote poetry and some nonfiction.
And he wrote about food.
He wrote a lot about food. In fact,
Dwight
Grove just recently brought out a collection of his food writing. And even in the fiction, the characters are always, cooking elaborate feasts over campfires. So, it's like the outdoorsy, manly thing, but also the kind of finicky, gustatory
but appetites.
Aesthete.
Yeah.
There's a great profile of him online that readers can find by Tom Bissell that was in Outside Magazine several years ago. It's really good.
That's perfect. That's a perfect assignment and a perfect place to publish it.
Pamela, you've had a lot of time to read because you took a couple of very long airplane rides recently.
It's so unusual. I was on the airplane to Australia and back, and then actually had some spare time in Australia to read and had some reading to do because I was there and among other things was interviewing Anne Enright and Colson Whitehead. So I read The Gathering and I finished The Green Road. And then I was reading Zone 1 because I wanted to talk to Colson Whitehead, not only about the Underground Railroad, which he's talked about on this podcast before, but I also thought it was a good time to talk about zombies. And I'd promised him not to talk about...
Never a bad time.
Never a bad time, but especially a good time now to talk about the end of the world. And he didn't want to talk about Trump because he was doing a panel about Trump the night before. So I was reading Zone 1 and I was really into it, and it fell into the bathtub. And it didn't just like fall and float lightly on the surface so that it was...
It plunged.
It plunged. It was submerged. It was down there.
I've lost many a good book.
Yeah. I took a picture of it so that I could, have proof with
and it's
Colson.
this like waterlogged monstrosity when you finally fish it out. Yeah.
Yes. And then also on the theme of water, just for kicks, when I was over there, I read Another Great Day at Sea by Jeff Dyer, which I enjoyed tremendously. And I was going to bring it back with little marked up sections to read aloud on the podcast.
That's the one where he spent like a week on an aircraft carrier, right?
Yes, he spent a week on 2 weeks on a military aircraft carrier. It was funny. It was one of those books where I thought that the immersion journalism was for a much longer period. Like I thought he was going to be on there for 6 months. And so it was a little disappointed when I found out.
That's not Jeff Dyer.
For Jeff Dyer, 2 weeks is 6 months. I think.
Yeah. Well, it's a little bit like that Nicholson Baker substitute teacher thing where I thought he was there for a year, but I think it turned out it was actually much.
It was like a Thursday afternoon math class.
In a class. But anyway, I meant to bring it back, but then in kind of an effort to lighten my load, I gave out all of the books that I'd finished in the lobby of the hotel. I was there for the Sydney Writers Festival and sort of scattered around the hotel were, George Saunders and Joy Williams and Anne Enright and some fellow journalists from Slate. And so I sort of passed out the books, like who wants the Jeff Dyer? And, everybody kind of took them. So I can't read portions aloud.
I saw something, I think, on Twitter where you said you were sharing a cab with Joy Williams, which made me so jealous.
Yes. Yeah, I know. That was a little bit of showing off.
No, that's great.
In the Twitter sphere. And then I also read David Sedaris' Diaries, which he was obviously on the podcast earlier, which I highly recommend. And I've just turned now to a book called Great Expectations, The Sons and Daughters of Charles Dickens by Robert Gottlieb. We've talked a little bit about Bob Gottlieb, author of Avid Reader and former editor-in-chief of Knopf and Simon & Schuster and of The New Yorker in the podcast in the past. And you've read this, Pearl.
I love this book. This book, and Richard Locke has another book about children in literature. And they're both like beautiful books about what children signify, innocence and different kinds of experience. And it always ends up being somewhat autobiographical, I think.
Is the book about Dickens's real-life children?
His real-life children. He had 10 children, possibly an 11th. And Bob Gottlieb gave this copy to me and said it was really a book about parenting.
Mm-hmm.
So I've only just started it, and all I can say
One
is...
of literature's most unhappy marriages ever.
Yes, things were very clearly not going well between Charles Dickens and Catherine Hogarth.
Yeah,
Apparently she bore him 10 children, and then she kind of looked like she'd bore him 10 children, and that did not bode well for their relations. But, Bob Gottlieb is such a good writer, and you just, it reads itself. It's
what looks nice about that book is that it looks very pleasantly kind of self-contained. It's short, about a very big subject and a big family. I like books like that.
I mean, and who wrote better about children than Dickens, right? Like Pip and Oliver Twist and David Copperfield, and it's just really nice to learn a little bit about the kids he was surrounded by.
So, Parl, what 14 books have you been reading?
Well, actually, it has been a good week. It has been a good week for reading. And this is my thing. I think publishing should really agitate for the 3-day weekend because that's when you read. Monday, when I was off, I lay on a couch and I read.
I've often said that I want to run for president, and my only platform is going to be Universal 3-day weekends.
I'm with you, John.
It won't matter what I
will be
think
out
about
there
anything
canvassing.
else.
But I didn't finish I Love Dick because I am one of life's great quitters. And
you'd already read it before.
I know, but I wanted to stick with it, and then I kind of just got distracted. And I got distracted by one book that an author named Samantha Irby. Have you guys read her?
No.
I just read one essay of hers.
I saw the cover of that book with the cat, and I thought, Parl's in.
No, it's not about cats at all. It's not about, I think maybe, is there a cat?
It does have a cat on the cover.
It does have a cat. It has a very angry-looking cat. So Samantha Irby is this, she's a blogger and a writer, and she has a book of comic essays, a genre I hate because I never find them funny. Like, they're absolutely just these really agonizing feats of I don't even know what to sit through. But she is one of life's great curmudgeons, and she's this woman who has a lot of debt. She's got colitis. She's got nothing working out. She hates going outside. She just is so funny and cranky and strange and can riff endlessly on terrible dudes she's dated and great novels she wants to read and great feats of bravery she'd like to perform. She's just great. So check it out. It's called We Are Never Meeting in Real Life. And it's also a really good book about living on the internet and what the internet allows particular kinds of introverts to sort of
From my dipping into it, it's very honest, and it's also, we should say, very NSFW.
Yeah, I can't read anything on this podcast, which is a great endorsement. I was like, maybe I'll tell this anecdote, and I'm like, no, you can't.
Janet Maslin included it in her recent roundup of summer reading, and we were looking for a couple of lines to sort of contextualize something from one essay, and I said, I really can't find one or two
it's too good. So I love that. And then in this weekend's issue, I have a piece about Leonora Carrington, who's this great British surrealist, and part of what I wrote about in this piece are writers who write outside of their native languages. And I wrote a little bit about Beckett, and I went to see Happy Days, which is playing at the New Shakespeare Theatre, and I went and I've just been rereading that play, which is fantastic. Have you guys seen it? It's the whole play is this woman buried in sand for the first half of it, and then there's an intermission. You come back and the sand is now up to her neck. And it's just fantastic. And it reminds me a little bit of I Love Dick because it's a book about being stuck. Mm-hmm. And it's a book about growing old and growing old with a particular person if you're lucky or unlucky or whatever. But it's this great, really, really funny, wicked play and piece about, I think, especially growing old as a woman. And it was just incredibly depressing and yet hilarious. So
that sounds like Beckett.
Yeah, indeed.
All right. Well, we've given everyone much reading to follow up on and play. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Inside the New York Times Book Review is produced by Pedro Rosado. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.